Luke chapter 15, and going to be reading the parable of the lost son. And this is one of those parables that has been put into movie, that has been made into different stories all over the place. I remember as a young boy, Billy Graham, it seemed like almost every Billy Graham movie that was put out into the theater was about a prodigal son or a prodigal daughter. Anyway, so starting at verse 11, it says, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, 'What's going on?' 'Your brother has come home,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" Question for you. Have you ever lost anything? Put your hands in the air if you did. Yes? And have you found it? Sometimes you don't. The question is, when you do find it, what is the reaction? You're happy, aren't you? I mean, it brings joy to your heart. You know, I have been lost in so many ways. You know, I have found myself lost in some of the bigger malls in some cities. Not able to figure out how to get to where I wanted to go. How do you get to that food court anyway? I found myself in the woods and, lost my way. And found my way out because, well, you eventually get out. I'm still here to tell you the tale. I've also felt lost sitting in my chair in my office. I felt lost in a group of people where you're surrounded by people, but you still feel alone or lost. through something on your own. There was 2 experienced hunters. They went hunting into the woods, and the game warden warned them that they might get lost because it's fairly thick woods. And so he told them that if you get lost, fire 3 shots in rapid succession into the air, and in due course, I will come and find you. And so, well, they did get lost. And one said to the other, you better fire the 3 shots. And so he fired 3 shots, and well, nothing happened. After a while, the first hunter said, you better fire another 3 shots. And so 3 more shots were fired into the air. And they waited another hour or so, and still nothing happened. Again, the first hunter turned to the second and said in great distress, I guess you had better fire 3 more shots. And his friend said, I can't. I've run out of arrows. We come to the lost son. It says in chapter 15, 14 to 16, it says this. It says, after he had spent everything. So we need to go back a second here. In that day, and even today, I mean, it wouldn't be all that well looked upon if, your dad is still alive and you say, Father, I want my share of the estate. In those days, it was unheard of. You would never do that. Never. It wasn't within the culture. It wasn't within that time. But he went to his dad anyway. A little bit of brashness, I would say. A little bit of, I don't need you anymore. I can make my own way. And he gets his money. And he goes off and he, as it says, he squanders it. He doesn't invest it. He doesn't go out and start a business. He goes out and he does what he wants to do. He squanders it in loose living. And it says, after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. We've got to stop there for a second. In Jewish culture, you do not eat pig. You do not raise pigs. You do not have anything to do with pigs because they are an unclean animal. And in that day, I mean, today, I suspect there are some Jews that eat bacon. I'm pretty sure it happens. But in those days, it would not. Never. And here he is. He's hired himself out to a farmer to serve pigs. If you could say it this way, he has reached the bottom. There is no further to go. He's got no resources. He's hungry, and he's serving a farmer and feeding pigs. And you can see how low it gets, because he says he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. He had hit the very bottom. There was no further to go. It often takes a great sorrow or a great tragedy to cause people to look to the only one who can help them. I was talking to somebody there the other day, and they were saying that they worked with someone who was an atheist, and his mom had gotten sick. He knew that this gentleman was a believer, and he went to him and said, I need you to pray for my mom. And I want you to pray with me, not to go somewhere else. I want you to pray with me for my mom. It often takes that great sorrow and tragedy to cause people to look to the one source that can help, the one source that can lift up, the one source that can give. A number of years ago, February 24th of 2001, there was a 1-year-old little girl named Erica. And go figure, I found a picture of her. Somehow, she wandered out of her mother's bedroom and out of the house and spent an entire night in an Edmonton winter. When her mother woke, Layla, and looked for her to no avail, couldn't find her. But then she found her outside, and Erica appeared to be totally frozen. Her legs were stiff, her body was frozen, and all signs of life appeared to be gone. She was taken to the Edmonton's Children's Health Center, and God helped those doctors and those rescue workers to bring her back to life. And to the amazement of all, there appeared to be no sign of brain damage, and the doctors gave Erica a clear prognosis. Shortly after, she was able to hop and skip and play like all the other girls her age. And guess what I found on the internet? There she is today, alive, well, healthy. Some of us have wandered from our Father's house, and it's brought us near the point of death. Maybe your heart has hardened, or maybe your spiritual body looks as lifeless as this little girl in the snow. Or maybe you've just found yourself not as close to God as you once were. Or maybe you found yourself wandered away a little bit, wondering, considering. But you know what? God knows. God has noticed that you're missing. God is searching for us. And He can take our spirits and revive them, restore us. Just like this lost son, when the Father wrapped His arms around him, wouldn't have any more of what he had to say, and restored him and lifted him up. In there it says that He gave him a robe and He gave him a ring. You have to realize the significance of the ring. This ring wasn't like my wedding ring. It was a ring with an insignia on it. The family insignia, which carries all rights and privileges of a son. Because with that ring, with the insignia on it, he can then do correspondence. And, you know, in those days, they would put a drop of wax on things and then they'd press the insignia into it. That's what He gave him. All the rights and privileges. He restored him. What does it say? It says, let's see. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. This father forgave. In 15 verse 20, in Luke, it says, so he got up and went to his father. But when he was a long way off, his father saw him. A long way off. His father was scanning, waiting, seeking, wanting. And he was filled with compassion and ran to him. Ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. This week, you know that it's been a difficult week, but I need to tell you a story. On Tuesday, we got the word. Tracy, Catherine, wait, just give me a second. I called up Benjamin and told him. He was in Fredericton, heading to Montreal to get a couple of engines, Skinny engines, because they had a trade show this weekend and they needed to get these engines. He got to Montreal, and then he thought it'd be a half hour to get these engines. Well, half hour turned into 4, and so they had to stay the night in in Montreal. So Thursday, they're coming back, and they got to Fredericton, and he called. He said, "Can you come and get me?" Well, I said, "Of course I can come get you." What happened is all the lug nuts came off one of the tires, except for one. And so then they had to figure out how to get it fixed and all the rest of it. Anyway, I arrived. And he said, up to this point, he said, my jimmies were rustled. That's how he put it to me. He said, on Tuesday, when you called me, my jimmies were rustled. That means that he was beside himself. And he said, when I got to Montreal, and the engines weren't there in this building, and we had to go to another building, and then it was just... my jimmies were rustled, and we had to get things done because I had to go. And then we were at the wrong place, and then we had to go to the other place, and then we got the engines, we got them onto the thing, but then we didn't have enough cords to keep them down, and then we ended up going to Canadian Tire and getting more, ratchet straps and all the rest of it. And by that time, it was too late. We had to stay the night in Montreal. My jimmies were rustled, he said. And then they couldn't find a hotel room because some flights were canceled, and so all the hotels were booked to solid. And so they're trying to find a place to stay, and he's just beside himself. He says, we need to go. We can't stay here. I need to get to Halifax. And so when I get to Fredericton, and I said, how you doing? He said, I'm at peace now, Dad, because you're here. Because you're here. Wow. God changes things. I was able to be there. Able to help him. You're going to flip past the next picture here, Catherine, because I'm going to go past that story. I had another story for you, but for another day. So the Father embraces him, lifts him up, restores him. And you know what that son felt at that time? Restoration. Peace. Man, I have blown it, but he is still willing to forgive me. I have blown it, but he is still willing to accept me in. Thank you, sir. I have blown it. And then you have the older son. He is beside himself. How dare he come back home? And how dare you, Dad, accept him in and restore him and have a celebration for him? The younger son in this parable represents the tax collectors, the sinners, the Gentiles, those like us who are accepted by God, who are given restoration. The forgiving Father, well, of course, that's our Father God, who welcomes us in. The older son, well, that's the Pharisees. They're angry, they're resentful that these people would be allowed into the kingdom. You see, the Pharisees must have thought the same thing. We have sacrificed so much and done so much for God. How dare you? How easy is it to resent God's gracious forgiveness of others whom we consider to be far worse sinners than ourselves? But when our self-righteousness gets in the way of rejoicing, when others come to Jesus, we are no better than the Pharisees sometimes. But you know what? It is an amazing thing to see somebody come to Christ, to be restored, to be reconciled, In Luke 15:32 it says, we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Have you been lost? Or do you know someone who is lost? Have you been feeling far away from God? Let him welcome you in. Let him wrap his arms around you. And those that you know that don't know, tell them with gentleness and respect. Don't beat people up. Lift them up. Let's pray together.